Good afternoon, and welcome to episode 92 of the Political Mike podcast. Vice presidential debates are usually forgettable. They don't usually go down in history for memorable zingers or iconic lines. In 1988's vice presidential debate, however, the atmosphere was different. The stakes were high for both candidates, and the crowd was animated. The question posed to then Republican Senator Dan Quayle, the running mate of Vice President George H.W. Bush, was what qualifications do you have to be president if it fell on you to become the nation's next commander-in-chief? The 41-year-old senator from Indiana went on to explain the portfolio of responsibilities that he would be handling as vice president and that would prepare him. Then he exclaimed, "I have far more experience than many others that sought the office of vice president of this country. I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency." It was Miss Judy Woodruff, the only woman moderator of the debate that night in Omaha, Nebraska, who then turned to the Democratic nominee for vice president, Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen, running mate of Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, who shot back, "Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you are no Jack Kennedy." Miss Judy Woodruff has had a long and distinguished career as one of America's most accomplished journalists. She formerly served as senior correspondent and the former anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She recently stepped down last month. She has covered politics and other news for 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. At PBS from 1983 to 1993, she was the chief Washington correspondent for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. From 1984 to 1990, she also anchored PBS's award-winning documentary series Frontline with Judy Woodruff. Moving to CNN in 1993, she served as anchor and senior correspondent for 12 years. Among other duties, she anchored the weekly program Inside Politics. She returned to the NewsHour in 2007, and in 2013, she and the late Gwen Ifill were named the first 2 women to co-anchor a national news broadcast. After Gwen Ifill's death, Ms. Judy Woodruff was named the sole anchor. Ms. Woodruff, thank you so much for being a part of the Political Mic today. I want to open up the discussion by asking you whether it has, being that you've been a part of so many huge headlines, and you've been responsible as a journalist to convey in a nonpartisan way to the American people the news, the facts as they are. Was there ever a moment where it was tempting to become part of the story or to inject your opinions rather into the story? And if so, when was that?
Hi, Mike. It's great to be with you. And the answer is no. I mean, it's not that I don't have views on the stories that I cover. I'm human. I have opinion. I don't believe actually there's such a thing as objectivity on the part of reporters. I think we're all human. We're the sum total of our experiences. I'm a woman. I'm a mother, grandmother. I've covered politics, as you just said, for more than 5 decades. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for more than 4 decades. So I've had a lot of experiences, and the sum total of that is who I am. And so I do have opinions, but I was trained as a reporter to keep those opinions to myself, that my job was to go out to report, to bring back the facts, and to share those with our viewers, readers, followers. And that's what I do. And so, no, I haven't been tempted. It's not that I don't have some strong opinions privately. I do, but I keep them to myself.
So in alignment with that, Ms. Woodruff, how do you feel about, the rise of so many polarizing sources of news that, bring Americans' attention every which way? many of which convey false information that's not 100% accurate. And we've seen the effects of that with January the 6th. We've seen the effects of that with the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband in October. And now most recently, the riots that have occurred in Brazil that are very comparable to the January 6th riot that took place in the Capitol 2 years ago. What is your opinion on the rise of so many sources of news that play on people's emotions, that play on people's fears, and really serve to only further divide and polarize the country further?
Well, it's a huge change from what we had maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when the news, I think, was more defined by what we today call mainstream media. There were 3 television networks. There were, maybe it was more than a few decades ago, 3 television networks, major newspapers across the country that did independent reporting. Today, as you know, so many newspapers have either closed down altogether or they've shrunk dramatically because of the rise of the internet. People can get the news for free. They're not going to pay for a subscription. And today, as you're absolutely right, opinion is rampant. We swim in a sea of opinion. I think it's much harder for Americans to get information today. The burden is much greater on consumers of news to understand what's real, what's vetted, what's confirmed, and what is just a rumor or completely made up and disinformation. So the American people have a much tougher time today than they used to. You know, we started out as a country, we've always had opinion journalism. We were the days of yellow journalism and the founding of the republic. But over time, Americans have come to prize and appreciate fact-based reporting. Today, though, that kind of reporting is getting lost in this ocean of opinion and rumor and frankly lies that they have to sort it all out. So I don't envy the ordinary American news consumer. There are certain places I think they can turn, like the PBS NewsHour, certain other mainstream news organizations, but they have to be much more vigilant about the news that they consume.
And so I want to ask you as well, in alignment with that, what is your thoughts on, the news divisions turning into profit centers, and how did making news divisions into profit centers change the way you were managed as a reporter?
Well, it really has not affected it. I mean, it allows, I've been very fortunate. I've worked, I started out in local television in Atlanta, where I worked first for an ABC affiliate as the newsroom secretary. And then I moved to the CBS affiliate in Atlanta, where I was a reporter covering Georgia politics, Atlanta politics, the state legislature. I never, ever had interference either at the local level or at NBC News, where I went to report on politics in the White House for almost 10 years, and then to PBS, to the NewsHour, and then CNN, and then back to PBS. I've never had a boss tell me what to cover. Now, having said that, it is the case that in order to stay in business, commercial news organizations have to, they have advertisers and they have to appeal to advertisers. So they're thinking about how do we maximize audience. Advertisers want to advertise in places where their ads are going to be seen or read. And so that means you want a place that's, that has a high audience number. Well, how do you get a high audience number? Often it is by choosing to go to those stories that are, they may be interesting, they may be titillating, but they may not be the most important news. And so that there is that tension clearly at commercial news organizations. I'm fortunate everywhere I've worked, they've been able to balance that. And certainly at PBS, it's not an issue. Yes, we want an audience, we want people to watch, but we don't have to worry about that daily pressure for ratings. Are people watching? Are they not? What kind of news should we be covering? It's not killing a particular story, which frankly does happen at some news organizations. I'm not saying it never happens. I'm just saying it hasn't happened where I've worked. But there is that tension in commercial news organizations when you're trying to please a lot of people and get a lot of eyeballs on the program. You're gonna lean potentially toward covering stories that people find, as I say, interesting, titillating, rather than important. which is what has driven always the NewsHour in its decision about what news to put on the air.
So we recently lost another staple in American journalism, Barbara Walters, this past, actually, I think it was the cusp of the new year. I think the 30th or the 31st of December. What are some of the ways in which the points of view, the perspectives of women improve the way we understand the news in your view?
Well, a number of ways, because for the longest time it was only men who were news reporters, virtually only men. I mean, I remember reading about the journalism earlier in the 20th century, certainly the journalism in Washington during the 1950s, 60s. At some point along the way, probably, and I think it was probably in the 1960s, and then certainly in the 1970s when I came in to covering Washington politics, there were more women. But the perspective, as I think I mentioned a minute ago, journalists are the sum total of who they are, their experiences, whether they've grown up traveling around the world, living in a small town, growing up in a rural area, their family background, their ethnic background, where have they lived, who have they, what have their growing up circumstances? Were they from a family, for example, neither of my parents went to college. I had to borrow money to get through school. So my background is very different from someone who was handed, their education. And I know that affects my view of the world. It has to, just as your, experiences growing up would affect how you cover and report on the news. So we each are reflective of our backgrounds, and women have a different set of experiences. We're daughters, we're sisters, we're wives, mothers, friends, female friends. We just have a different set of experiences. And in my experience, women often will, certainly in the beginning, would point to the importance of covering stories about children and about children's welfare, about families, healthcare in many instances. We got away from just sort of the hard news, covering wars and politics, all of which is important, but to expand that to cover American life in totality. And that's what we should be covering today. We can't cover just a piece of America. We need to cover all aspects of America, from the inner cities to the rural areas. Our coverage should reflect America overall.
And so in alignment with that, Ms. Woodruff, I know that when you stepped down, you had briefly mentioned that you're going to now travel around the country in your next chapter. Could you elaborate on some of the work that you'll be doing now that you're no longer going to be the managing editor and main anchor for the PBS NewsHour?
Sure. I'm glad to do that. I'm very excited. Stepping down from anchoring after 11 years of anchoring in one form or another for the NewsHour, to embark on a 2-year project, frankly, to try to understand Americans better, to understand where they're coming from, how they see their role as citizens, and certainly how they perceive what a lot of people describe as a major political divide in our country. Do Americans feel that divide? How has it manifested itself in their community, in their family? Are they able to have Thanksgiving dinner with the rest of the family? Are they estranged from other family members? I mean, I know because I hear from people who will say, I can't sit down with my son or my father or my mother or my sister, brother, neighbor, cousin, because they have diametrically different political views. And to try to understand how that's so different. I mean, this country's always had strong views. We've had people across the political spectrum, but it feels like there's something different now. And it feels to me like it's a more personal division. People are calling each other names. They're saying, well, I can't tolerate being with that person. I don't want to live on the same street as someone who believes that. And so trying to understand that, talking to Americans about it is my goal for the next 2 years. We're going to produce pieces that will be largely focused on Americans, but we'll also be interviewing quote unquote experts, talking to academics, educators. I mean, we're now divided on what children should be taught in school. How much of American history should they learn? We never argued about those kinds of things before. People may have had different ideas, but now there are big fights at school board meetings. Elections have become the scenes of big arguments and physical fights. Sometimes we saw, you mentioned a moment ago what happened to former Speaker Pelosi's husband at his home. Someone broke into his home and attacked him with a hammer. I mean, goodness gracious, where are we going as a country? And so I want to talk to Americans and to the experts, and we'll be reporting every other week and then eventually every week on the NewsHour, doing some specials as well.
So on that note, I know I touched on a little bit earlier about, the different sources of news and avenues in which Americans can tune into. But do you think that the credibility of the press has forever been lost? Because, people have always revered the press as the fourth estate. But now that we have anchors who kind of make their living, like you said earlier, on trying to generate ratings and views at whatever cost, I'm thinking of, certain, folks on Fox News and Newsmax and even, some individual broadcasters like Steve Bannon who, encouraged what we saw in Brazil and even said, I'm not going to back down an inch when asked, whether he regrets, playing a role in encouraging folks to storm their capital down there in Brazil. Do you think that the credibility is forever lost in journalism?
Well, 2 points I would make, at least 2 points. One is, I think we want to be careful when we talk about what is the press and what isn't, because I'm old-fashioned. I believe reporters fill one important role in American society. They report the news, they deliver the news in one form or another. They write about it, or they deliver it on television, or they work online. They write about it and you read it on your device, or all of the above. That's reporting. If someone's going on television or in print or radio and they're just giving their opinion, and it's not based in information or fact or anything that was checked out, and it's just opinion, that's different. Yes, they can call themselves journalists or podcasters or radio talk show hosts or whatever, but I hope the American people hold on to an understanding of the difference between reporting and pure opinion based on nothing but opinion, and that is not checked out, and they may believe it fiercely, but it's not fact-based. And so I make that distinction. And so some of the people you mentioned, I put in the latter category. I don't think they are checking it out. I'm not saying everything they say is false, because they clearly do some homework, but they are also, some of them are putting information out there that isn't checked out, isn't accurate. And so that's part of my answer to your question. The other part is that I certainly hope that any damage that's been done over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years by our political leaders who have called the news fake news just because they disagreed with it, or they've called reporters enemies of the American people, which of course is not true. That's the farthest thing from who I am and the people I know in journalism. So I certainly hope it's not permanent. I refuse to believe that it is, but it is the case that the reputation of journalists, the credibility of journalists across the board has been hurt by these political leaders who persist in denigrating and downgrading and demeaning the press just because they don't like what the press is reporting. And so all of us in the media have to work doubly, triply hard now to earn that trust again. We have to have that credibility. What I have always said to my colleagues at the NewsHour, and I would say it in any news organization, once you've lost credibility, it's very hard to earn it back. And we have to work very hard. I mean, that's the only asset we have, frankly. We get paid a salary, sure, but what our value is purely in our credibility. And if people don't believe in us, then we've lost, the value of who we are, what we do. So to me, it's just essential that we do everything we can every day to win back credibility with the American people. It's essential.
And when you started off, Ms. Woodruff, in your career, I think it was during the Carter administration, and you were a White House correspondent, and you moved up the ranks. So what were some of the ways in which you distinguished yourself as a White House correspondent and journalist from your peers?
Well, when I started covering the White House for NBC News, I had already covered local news in Atlanta the Georgia state legislature, the governorship of Jimmy Carter, Maynard Jackson as mayor of Atlanta. I'd covered some of the civil rights leaders. I had covered John Lewis in Atlanta, Julian Bond. I had some years of experience under my belt, but I had never covered Washington before. And so frankly, I was scared out of my mind. I mean, I felt completely unqualified when I came to cover the White House for NBC, even though I was all of 31 years old. I was scared to death, and I felt I had to prove myself every day by working as hard as I possibly could, getting up early, staying up late, reading everything I could. And I was very conscious of my lack of credentials, frankly, and lack of experience compared to everybody else I was competing against in Washington, who it felt like to me had been here a lot longer than I had, and who had a lot more experience and knew a whole lot more. They knew more people, they had more information, they had more history, whereas I was scrambling to just play catch up all the time. I did know the Carter people from Georgia, so that was an asset. I had those relationships with them. I knew who they were. I knew about their relationships with the president, but that wasn't enough in Washington. It helped some, but it didn't make all the difference. And so I was running scared every day.
And so, being that you started off so nervous as, a journalist and a White House correspondent, and you ended up moderating some high stakes presidential and vice presidential debates, how did you know when to follow up and when to force the candidate to clarify their answer and to get more specific, and when to move on to another topic and let the voters decide and determine whether the candidate's answer was sufficient or satisfactory?
I would say that it's a combination of experience and judgment. First of all, do your homework. When you're asking a question, kind of anticipate what the answer is going to be based on what the candidate has said about it before. And when you sense that they're ducking it or they're not answering it for whatever reason, you try to get them back on course, try to get them to answer it. And I think you use your judgment to determine how much time you want to spend re-asking the same question in so many different ways. At some point, it becomes clear to the audience. Anybody reading or watching on television can tell when somebody's ducking a question. Usually it becomes clear. But our job as journalists is to try to, in a debate, frankly, help the candidates show as much of themselves as possible to the voters. These debates are not about the reporters or the moderators. They're about the candidates. So I was always thinking, okay, what is it that I need to, what subjects is the public most, are going to be most valuable for the public to hear about right now? Or sometimes it's an issue where the candidate has not made himself or herself clear. So our job may be to try to pin them down a little bit more. So it does vary to some extent, or sometimes it's an issue that's new. We haven't heard their opinion yet. But in any case, you're trying to get them to be clear, to share their thinking with the public, even to share, how they think about things with the public. Do they tackle them straight on? Do they sort of duck and weave? And again, it's doing your homework, having some experience, and then using judgment, your best possible judgment, and determining how long to stick with one issue before you move on to the next one.
So, Ms. Woodruff, I have to ask you before I let you go, what was the most exciting presidential campaign that you covered and why?
Oh my goodness, there have been so many. I would say two of them, and for different reasons. The 1976, when Jimmy Carter won, was exciting because I had covered him as governor of Georgia. Here was somebody I knew who was being elected president of the United States. That was pretty exciting. But other than that, I would say the election of 2000, when the election, as you know, went on for an additional 38 days because it was so close. They were hanging chads in the state of Florida. They couldn't figure out what the vote was. It was a couple of hundred votes. It went to the courts, and ultimately, as you know, the Supreme Court decided it. It was, I thought I would never see an election like that. That was 2000. And then the other one, of course, I have to say, was the election of President Obama, because it was so historic. I had covered him some on the campaign trail. I was in Grant Park in Chicago the night of the election, and I'll never forget, I think there were 1 million people who flooded into streamed into the park, and just the electricity in the air and the sense that the country had come together in a way for the first time to elect a Black American president of the United States. It was historic. So a number of them have been, they've all been memorable. And a number of them certainly so memorable for different reasons. 2008 because of the history being made, 2000 because of the history, and I would say 1976 because of my personal experience.
And the last question I want to ask you before I let you go, Ms. Woodruff, is, for someone who's coming up in journalism and aspiring to become someone who's a political analyst and journalist like himself, what advice do you have for someone like that, especially in today's climate where there's so many ways in which people can get news, and politics is so heated now, and it seems as if people only want to tune into folks who agree with them and back up or reinforce what they want to hear. What's your advice to someone who's trying to cut through all of that and just make themselves a good career in journalism?
I would say don't give up. Keep at it as long as you really want to do this. We need you. Jump in. The water's fine. We need all the smart, young, curious, determined, hardworking, won't take no for an answer young people in journalism as we can possibly have. And by journalism, I mean people who want to report, not just people who want to be on the air or who want to express opinion. We need young people to get into journalism, to go out and dig up facts, to dig up information, and to share that information with the American people, and to do it in a fair and a honorable way. That's what we need. I mean, our democracy is not strong unless we have a strong, free press. And the way we keep the press free and strong is by having young people who keep coming in, doing the hard work, and sticking with it. And again, not taking no for an answer, not getting discouraged. And yes, you'll meet setbacks. Failure is part of the definition of any life, but just keep going and keep at it. That would be my advice.
Well, Ms. Woodruff, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you and hearing from you, and the valuable knowledge and insight that you brought.
Mike, glad to speak with you. So glad you're doing this podcast, and all the best to you, and look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you, ma'am, and good luck on your next venture.
Thank you.
With that being said, this concludes episode 92 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.